In October of 1994, in a fluorescent-lit county auction room in Wadena County, Minnesota, a forester named Dale Brunner looked at the back row, found the only woman who had raised her hand and laughed. A small laugh he probably forgot by supper. The lot was 40 acres of burned-over jack pine and aspen along the Leaf River, scorched the summer before in a fire that had jumped a logging slash pile and run for 2 days. Most of the standing timber was dead or dying. The soil, by the county's own assessment, was thin and sandy and unfit for row crops. The minimum bid had been set at $175, and nobody else in the room wanted it. Margaret Holt raised her hand and offered the minimum. And Dale Brunner laughed and said gently, "The way a man does when he thinks he is doing someone a kindness, ma'am? You understand you're buying ash." 22 years later, in the spring of 2016, a buyer for a national grocery chain signed a purchase agreement for product coming off that same 40 acres. And the number at the bottom of the page was large enough that the woman who typed it called Margaret twice to confirm she had not added a zero. She had not added a zero. This is the story of the years between those two moments and of a kind of knowing that does not show up on a soil survey. Let me tell you about Margaret Holt, because the auction room got her wrong in the way that rooms like that usually do. She was 51 years old that October, a widow of 4 years, and she had spent her whole life within 9 miles of where she sat. She was known in that county for 2 things. The first was that she almost never spoke unless she had something to say, which people sometimes mistook for shyness and sometimes for slowness, and which was neither. The second was that she could look at a stand of trees and tell you things about the ground beneath them that the ground itself seemed reluctant to admit. She had learned that from her father, Elias, who had run a small charcoal kiln on the family place through the lean decades and who had died in 1981, leaving her a leather-bound ledger filled with 30 years of notes on wood, fire, heat, and char. In 1994, almost nobody in that part of the state had any use for charcoal made the old way. The briquettes that filled the hardware stores came out of factories, pressed from sawdust and coal dust into binder, uniform and cheap and faintly chemical. The idea that anyone would pay a premium for lump charcoal burned slow in an earthen mound, the way Elias had done it, struck the county as a quaint piece of the past, like a butter churn on a windowsill. Dale Brunner was not wrong about the timber on that woodlot. He was wrong about what timber was for. Stay with me here, because the thing Margaret saw in that burned ground is the whole story, and it is not what you would guess. I will get to it. The 40 acres along the Leaf River had been logged hard in the 1,970 seconds and then left, and the fire that ran through it in the summer of 1993 had killed most of the merchantable pine. To a forester pricing standing sawlogs, that was a near-total loss. The dead trees would rot or fall. Replanting would cost more than the land was worth. The county wanted it off the tax rolls. To Dale Brunner, the math was simple, and the math said ash. Margaret read the same ground and saw something else entirely. She saw 40 acres of standing dead hardwood and jack pine that was already half-seasoned by the fire that killed it, sun-dried where it stood, and she saw the species mix her father's ledger said made the finest, hottest, longest-burning lump charcoal a person could produce. Dead standing timber, cured by a fire and a year of dry air, was not a loss to her. It was raw material that the market had not yet learned to want, sitting on land nobody else would bid on. To the bank, it was a write-off. To the county, it was a liability. To Margaret, it was a kiln's worth of the exact wood she needed, and a price of $175. She paid in cash in tens and twenties counted out at the clerk's window, while a man behind her in line shifted his weight inside, and she folded the receipt into the bib pocket of her jacket and buttoned it. The clerk, a young woman named Ruth who had grown up 2 farms over, asked her quietly if she was sure the way you ask someone you do not want to embarrass. Margaret said she was sure. She said it the way she said most things, with no weight on it at all, which somehow carried more weight than insistence would have. She drove home in a 1979 Ford pickup, the color of a rained-on barn, the heater fan ticking, the receipt in her pocket, and the men in the lot watched her go and shook their heads, not unkindly. One of them, a younger man who hauled gravel, said out loud what several of them were thinking, that the old widow had bought herself $175 worth of firewood and a lot of stumps. Another said she would not get a road in there without spending more than the land was worth. They were not cruel about it. They were simply certain, in the easy way a room full of people becomes certain when they all measure the same way. They thought she was grieving. They thought a lonely woman had bought a sad piece of ground because her late husband, a quiet man named Walter, who had died of a bad heart in the spring of 1990, used to hunt grouse along the Leaf in the good years. They were wrong about that, too. Margaret had not bought a memory. He had bought 40 acres of the exact wood her father's ledger had taught her to want, and she knew it to the dollar. And she let them think what they liked, because explaining was never a thing she did when the ground would explain it for her in time. Let me tell you about her father's ledger, because it is the inherited thing at the center of all this, and without it, none of what came later makes sense. Elias Holt had been the son of a Norwegian immigrant who settled the home quarter in 1911, and Elias had kept the family solvent through the 1,930 seconds and the 1,950 seconds by burning charcoal for the blacksmiths and foundries. He did it in earthen kiln, which is to say, he did not burn wood in the open. He stacked seasoned hardwood in a careful dome, covered it with sod and damp earth, lit it from a central flue, and then spent days controlling how much air reached the fire. The whole trick, was starving the burn. Charcoal is what wood becomes when you heat it hot enough to drive off all the water and the volatile gases, but deny it enough oxygen to actually combust to ash. Get the air wrong, and you get a pile of cinders or a pile of half-burned sticks. Get it right, and you get nearly pure carbon, light and black and ringing when you knock 2 pieces together, burning at a heat and a steadiness that no factory briquette has ever matched. Elias had written it all down. He wrote down which woods gave which heat, sugar, maple and oak, and ironwood for the hottest, longest burn, because the dense hardwoods carry more wood per cubic inch and so more carbon to the char. Aspen and pine for a faster, lower fire, good for kindling a load, but not for finishing. He wrote down moisture, and he was severe about it, because green wood spends the fire's energy boiling off its own water instead of becoming char, and a load packed even a little too wet would smolder and sour and never ring. He wrote down seasons, and the color of the smoke at each stage, white and thick at first as the water cooked off, then thinning to a blue haze when the wood had given up its volatile gases and the char was nearly made. He wrote down the smell, which changed from a wet wood smoke to something sharper and then to almost nothing as the burn finished. He wrote down the sound, a finished mound made when you wrapped the crust, hollow where the wood had shrunk to carbon. He wrote down his failures, the loads he lost to a collapsed mound, or a wind that fed the fire too much air and burned his char to ash, and beside each failure he wrote what he should have done. 30 years of one man paying close attention to one narrow thing. That ledger was Margaret's real inheritance, worth more than the home quarter, though no appraiser would ever have said so. In the winter of 1994 and into the spring of 1995, Margaret began cutting the dead timber off the Leaf River 40. She did it slowly with a chainsaw older than some of the trees, and she hauled it back to the home place a few cords at a time. Her neighbors saw the smoke start to rise that summer, a thin, steady column from the low earthen mounds she built behind the barn, and they did not know what to make of it. A man named Carl Eklund farmed the section to the east, and Carl was the closest thing Margaret had to a foil in this story, though he never meant her any harm, and she never wished him any. Let me tell you about Carl because his path runs alongside hers for 20 years, and it matters how it ends. Carl Eklund was a good farmer and a confident one. In the middle 1,990 seconds, he did what the extension office and the seed dealers and the equipment salesmen all told him to do, which was to get big or get out. He borrowed against his land and bought a new tractor, then a new combine, then more land, and he put all of it into corn and soybeans. The two crops the system was built to reward. He drained a wetland to gain 40 workable acres. He bought a grain dryer and a pair of bins. By 2000, Carl Eklund farmed 1,900 acres of two crops and owed the bank more than his father had earned in a lifetime. And he was, by every measure the county used, a success. He felt sorry for Margaret, burning sticks behind her barn like it was 1935. The first years were hard and quiet and produced very little money. Margaret burned charcoal and sold it, where she could, to a couple of blacksmiths who still worked iron the old way, to a man in Brainerd named Lyle, who restored antique cars and needed clean heat for brazing, to the occasional restaurant. Lyle was the first customer who understood, the first one who knocked two pieces together without being told to and listened to the ring and went quiet. He told her the factory stuff, fouled his work, left a residue, burned cool and uneven, and that hers did none of that. He paid her in full the first time and asked for more the second, and he did not flinch at the price, and Margaret wrote his name in the back of her own ledger, the first name on a list that would matter later. She kept her own ledger now beside her father's, recording every burn in the same close hand. The page for a single burn held the date, the wood by species and rough weight, the weather, the hour she lit the central flue, and then a column of times and colors and notes that ran down the margin as the burn went. White smoke, thick, water cooking off. Then later the line she lived for, smoke thinning, blue, near done. She was teaching herself what Elias already knew, and the ledger was her teacher and her father's voice at once. She lost loads. A mound slumped one wet October and let in too much air, and she opened it to cinders, and she wrote down why, and underneath she wrote what she should have done the same way her father had, so that the failure became a lesson instead of just a loss. By 1998, she was losing almost none, and the charcoal coming out of her mounds was as good as anything her father had made, hard and light and ringing, burning clean and hot with no chemical taint, leaving almost no ash. Word moves slowly in a thing like this, and then, all at once, the man in Brainerd told a chef. The chef told another chef. By the early 2000s, a small but real demand had grown up around Margaret's charcoal among people who cooked over live fire for a living and had learned that what you burn changes what you taste. Factory briquettes, pressed from sawdust and binders and sometimes a little coal, burn unevenly and leave a faint petroleum note that a good palate can find. Margaret's lump charcoal burned from oak and maple and ironwood off a burned-over woodlot, lit fast, burned hot and long, and left nothing behind but the food. She could not make enough of it. I want to stop here and say something to you directly, because this is the point in the story where most people would have done the obvious thing. They would have borrowed money, built a real kiln, hired help, and scaled up to meet the demand. If you have ever run a small thing that suddenly people wanted more of, you know exactly how loud that temptation gets. Margaret did not do the obvious thing, and the reason she didn't is the reason the story ends the way it does. Now let me get back to it. By 2004, Margaret had a problem that looked like a blessing, which is the most dangerous kind. Demand was outrunning supply. A distributor out of Minneapolis, named Gerald, came to the farm in a clean German sedan and offered to put her charcoal in stores across the upper Midwest on one condition, that she scale up production tenfold within 2 years. He had the numbers worked out on a laptop. He balanced on the hood of his car, the screen washing pale blue in the afternoon light. He talked about throughput and margin and unit economics. He used the word leverage as if it were a verb. He was a sincere man, sharp and not unkind, and he genuinely believed he was offering her the chance of a lifetime. And from inside the only way of measuring he had ever been taught, he was. He looked at the low earthen mounds behind the barn the way Dale Brunner had looked at the burned woodlot 10 years before, with the slight, patient pity of a man who knows things. And he said the words she had heard before in a friendlier voice. "This is a wonderful little hobby," he said, "but it doesn't scale." Margaret told him, no. She told him in one sentence the way she said most things. "It scales exactly as far as the wood does," she said, and she went back into the house. Let me tell you what she understood that the man with the laptop did not. The quality of her charcoal was not separable from the slowness of her method or the source of her wood. The earthen kiln worked because she could stand beside it for 3 days and read the smoke and adjust the air by hand. A factory could not do that. A factory would substitute a steel retort and a fixed schedule and uniform feedstock, and the product would be a commodity again, competing on price with the briquettes she had spent 10 years proving were inferior. Worse, scaling tenfold meant she would burn through her own woodlot in a few seasons, and then have to buy wood on the open market, green wood, wrong wood, wood she could not vouch for. Her whole advantage lived in the union, a method slow enough to control. Wood dead-cured on the stump by fire and weather, and the close attention of one person who had read 1,000 burns. Take any leg away, and the stool fell. The distributor was offering to saw off all 3 legs and call it growth. Around this time, the next person arrived who matters, and she arrived skeptical. Margaret's granddaughter, Anna, was 23 in 2005 and had just finished a business degree at the university in the Twin Cities. Anna loved her grandmother and was quietly mortified by her. She saw a brilliant, stubborn old woman sitting on real demand and refusing to capitalize it, and she came home that summer half intending to talk sense into her. Anna had spreadsheets. She had a 5-year projection. She had, she thought, a clear-eyed view of an opportunity her grandmother was too sentimental to seize. "You're leaving money on the table," Anna said the first week she was home, sitting at the kitchen table, where the 2 ledgers lay open under a single hanging light. "The demand is there. We could be in 200 stores by next year. You're choosing to stay small. Margaret did not argue. Arguing was not a thing she did. She did something better. She handed Anna a saw and a pair of gloves and said, "Stay through a burn first. Then tell me about the table." So Anna stayed. She helped cut and haul and stack. She stood beside her grandmother for 3 days, through a burn in the July heat, watching the smoke go from white to thin blue, learning to read the mound by its color and its sound and its smell. And somewhere in those 3 days, something turned over in her that no spreadsheet had prepared her for. She understood, standing there with ash on her arms, that what her grandmother was doing could not be photocopied. The thing she had wanted to scale was the thing that would die if she scaled it. She did not say so out loud that summer, yet she stopped talking about the 200 stores. Let me tell you about the dog, because he was there for all of it. And Margaret kept an old black farm dog named Soot, a name that started as a joke and stuck. And Soot lay beside the kilns through every burn, close enough to the warmth, far enough from the heat, and he was as much a fixture of the operation as the ledger or the mounds. He was getting gray around the muzzle by the summer. Anna came home, and he lifted his head when Anna learned to read the smoke, as if he had been waiting to see whether she would. The years from 2005 to 2012 were the long, patient middle of the thing, and from the outside, almost nothing seemed to happen. Margaret kept burning. The smoke rose behind the barn in the same thin, steady column it always had, spring and summer and into the fall, and the neighbors had long since stopped wondering about it. Anna went back to the city, took a job at a firm that did exactly the kind of grow-ordy work she had once wanted to bring home, and she came home most weekends, and the weekends got longer. She would drive up Friday night and be at the kilns by Saturday dawn, and she found that the spreadsheets that filled her week in the city felt thinner and thinner against the weight of a thing you made with your hands, and could knock against another piece and hear ring. At some point in there, Anna stopped thinking of it as her grandmother's hobby and started thinking of it as a business she did not yet know how to describe, a business whose whole value sat in the one place her training had taught her to cut. First, the slowness. Together, they did the one thing that was true to the method instead of against it. They did not scale the production. They scaled the price. They put the charcoal in a simple paper sack. No plastic, no factory gloss. The weight stamped on it by hand, and they priced it where a handmade thing belongs. And they sold every pound Margaret could make to people who understood why it cost what it cost. The operation stayed small, and the margin grew. Anna built the books, clean and honest, and learned that a small thing sold rightly to the right people could keep 2 households, without ever once getting big. Soot lay between them by the warm earth, grayer every season, and the work had a shape to it now that felt less like surviving and more like something being quietly, deliberately handed down. Carl Eklund across the section was having a different decade. The corn and soybean prices that had looked so reliable in the late 1992 did what commodity prices do, which is to fall when everyone plants the same thing. Carl had bet his whole operation on 2 crops and a lot of borrowed money, and through the late 2000s, the bet got tighter every year. He refinanced, he bought crop insurance, he planted fence to fence. He did everything right by the rules of the system he had committed to, and the system rewarded him with thinner and thinner returns and a debt load that did not move. He was not foolish. He was exposed. Wand. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole lesson. Then came 2012 and the drought. The summer of 2012 was the hottest and driest the upper Midwest had seen in a generation. From late June through August, The rain stayed away, and the temperature climbed and stayed climbed. Day after day, the sky came up white and hard and gave nothing. Corn that had tasseled into the heat could not pollinate, and the ears that formed came up half-filled or empty, kernels missing in long gaps down the cob like a smile with teeth knocked out. Fields that had looked like money in May turned to rustling brown paper by August, the leaves curling tight to conserve a moisture that was not coming. Across the county, across the whole region, the uniform corn and soybean ground that the system had spent 30 years building burned up in the field. Carl Eklund walked his 1,900 acres in the third week of July and pulled an ear and peeled it back and stood there a long time looking at it, and a neighbor who saw him said he set it down very gently on the ground, like a thing he did not want to hurt, and walked back to his truck. He ran the numbers at his own kitchen table late at night, the same table where his father had run them, and the numbers were the kind a man does not say out loud. He had crop insurance, and it would pay, and it would not pay nearly enough. He had refinanced 2 years before, and the new payments did not bend. He had planted fence to fence on borrowed money, because that was what a confident man did, and the confidence had been real, and it had not been enough, because confidence is not the same thing as resilience, and 2012 was the year that told the difference. The drought did to Carl exactly what the fire of 1993 had done to the woodlot, except in reverse. The fire had made Margaret's raw material. The drought destroyed Carl's. A monoculture is a field with one way to fail, and in 2012 it found it. Carl lost most of his crop. The insurance covered a fraction. The debt did not care about the weather. By the fall of 2012, Carl Eklund was quietly, methodically dismantling the empire. He had spent 20 years building, selling, equipment at auction to make payments, the new combine and the grain dryer, and the second tractor rolling out of his yard on flatbeds one at a time. The men who had watched Margaret drive away in her old Ford in 1994 were now watching Carl's machinery go the other direction, and nobody laughed at anything that fall. Margaret's operation did not even notice the drought. Her raw material was already dead. Dead standing timber does not care if it rains. Her woodlot, the burned-over 40 that Dale Brunner had called ash, sat untouched by the heat that was destroying the best cropland in the county, and her kilns burned on through the summer of 2012 at exactly the rate they always had. While the conventional path burned in the field, the patient path was unaffected, because it had never been built on the assumption that every year would be good. Resilience is just diversity that has been tested. Carl's farm had one way to win and one way to lose. Margaret's had been built without her ever using the word to survive the bad year. Anna saw it clearly now. She had a business degree, and she had stood through 100 burns, and she understood at last that her grandmother had not been refusing growth out of sentiment. She had been managing risk with a sophistication no professor had taught her. The small operation that looked fragile was the durable one. The big operation that looked solid had been a single bad summer, away from collapse the whole time. In 2013, Anna proposed the one form of growth that did not violate the method. Not more production, a brand. They would take the charcoal Margaret already made, the same small, careful output, and they would give it a name and a story and put it in front of the people who would pay the most for it. They called it after the river. Leaf River charcoal. Anna built it carefully, the way her grandmother built a burn, no shortcuts, and she did the thing she was actually good at, which was telling the truth about the product in a way that reached the people who wanted it. Let me tell you about the man who validated it, because his verdict is, What turned a local secret into a national one? In the autumn of 2015, a buyer named Theodore Voss came up from a national grocery chain that had built its reputation on specialty foods. He had heard about Leaf River charcoal from a chef in Minneapolis, and he came to the farm himself, which buyers at his level almost never do. He was a careful man and a quiet one, and he did not talk about throughput. He asked to see a burn. Margaret showed him one. He stayed the whole 3 days. He did not stay the way buyers stay, with a phone in his hand and a flight to catch. He brought a folding camp chair out of his rental car and set it a respectful distance from the mound, and he watched. He watched Margaret light the central flue and bank the earth, and open and close the air holes around the base with a flat iron tool worn smooth by her father's hands and then her own. He watched the smoke come up white and thick the first day, and asked what it meant, and she told him it was the water leaving the wood, and he wrote that down. He watched it thin on the second day toward a pale blue, and when he asked, she told him that blue was the wood giving up its gases, that the char was forming now in the starved heat under the sod, and that the trick of the whole thing was to hold the fire right at that edge, hot enough to drive everything off. Too starved of air to burn the carbon itself away, he wrote that down too. On the third day, he watched her read the mound by its color and its sound and the smell of it, and decide, without a thermometer, without a schedule, on nothing but 30 years of her notes and 20 of her own, that it was done. They opened it, and the charcoal came out hard and black and light, and Theodore Voss, who had tasted and judged specialty foods on 4 continents, went quiet in a way that Margaret recognized because she had seen Lyle go quiet the same way 20 years before. At the end of it, Voss took a single piece of finished charcoal from the cooling mound, and he knocked it against another piece, and he listened to the ring, and he held it to the light, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "How much of this can you make in a year?" he said, "without changing one thing about how you make it?" It was the opposite of the question the man with the laptop had asked in 2004. The distributor had wanted to know how big she could get. Voss wanted to know how good she could stay. Margaret told him her real annual output, the honest number, small and fixed. Voss nodded slowly, like a man who had just been told the price and found it fair. "Then that's what we'll take," he said. "All of it every year, and we'll pay what it's worth, not what charcoal costs." The agreement they signed in the spring of 2016 priced Leaf River charcoal, not as a commodity but as what it was, a handmade thing of rare quality made by one of the few people alive who still knew how. The chain would carry it nationwide in limited quantity as a premium product, and they would never ask her to make more than she could make well. The number at the bottom of the page, the price for a single year's small, honest output, was the number the woman in the office called twice to confirm. "I am not going to dress it up." The figure was $48,000. For one season's charcoal, off 40 acres of burned-over ground, bought for $175, $48,000. And it landed with a weight far past its size because of everything it stood on. It stood on a fire in 1993 that everyone else had read as ruin. It stood on $175 laughed at in an auction room. It stood on 30 years of a dead man's notes and 20 more years of his daughter's. It stood on 1,000 burns and 10,000 readings of the smoke. It stood on the word no, said to the distributor, in 2004, when yes would have turned the whole thing to cinders. The number was small. What it proved was not. Dale Brunner was retired by then, an old man in town, and he heard about it the way everyone hears about everything in a small county. secondhand at the grain elevator. The story goes that he was quiet for a while after, and then he said to no one in particular, "Well, I'll be." He was not a bad man. He had been a good forester, careful and honest, and he had priced that woodlot correctly by every standard he had been trained to use. He had simply been trained to measure standing saw logs, and the value on that ground was not in standing saw logs. He had measured the wrong thing precisely. That is the most common mistake there is, and the hardest to see, because being precise feels so much like being right. The distributor with the laptop heard too, and the story there is kinder than you might expect. He wrote Margaret a short note. He did not apologize exactly, because he was still not certain he had been wrong by the logic he used, and yet he wrote one line that showed he had understood something. "I see now," he wrote, "that I was measuring the cart and you were raising the horse." Carl Eklund and Margaret Holt ended their long parallel in a way that the county did not expect, and that does the most credit to both of them. After the drought, Carl was down to his home quarter and a heavy heart, and not much idea what to do next. He was 63, and he had farmed one way his whole life, and that way had failed him in a single summer. In the winter of 2014, before the national deal, Margaret walked across the section in the snow, which she had not done in years, and she stood in Carl's kitchen, and she did not offer him sympathy, which he would not have wanted, and she did not offer him advice, which he had heard enough of. She offered him a use for the dead and dying ash and oak in his own woodlots and fence lines, the trees no row-crop farmer had ever thought of as anything but obstacles. She offered to teach him to burn. Carl Eklund, who had felt sorry for Margaret in 1996, learned to make charcoal from her in 2015 in his 60s, starting over. The first burn he tried alone, he lost, the mound slumping and the air rushing in, and the whole load going to gray cinder, and he stood over the wreck of it, embarrassed in a way a successful man is rarely made to feel. He drove over to tell Margaret, expecting maybe that she would be kind about it, and instead she did something better. She got her father's ledger and turned to a page near the front, dated 1953, where Elias had written about a load he had lost the exact same way, and the words he had written underneath about what he should have done. "He lost them too," she said. "Everybody loses them. You write down why, and you don't lose that one again." Carl read the dead man's handwriting in the lamplight and understood that he had joined something older than his 1,900 acres had ever made him feel part of. He was not too proud to learn, and that was the saving of him. He never made it the way she did, not quite, but he made it well enough to sell into the demand the brand had created. And he kept his home quarter, and he found in the slow attention of the work, in standing beside a fire for 3 days, reading its smoke, something the 1,900 acres of corn had never once given him. The two of them, the woman who bought the burned woodlot and the man who drained the wetland, ended as neighbors who burned charcoal and read smoke and understood late and together the same thing. Anna runs Leaf River Charcoal now. She never went back to the city for good. She keeps both ledgers, her great-grandfather's and her grandmother's, in a wooden box on the kitchen table under the same single hanging light, and she has started a third in her own hand, dated from the year she took over, and she writes in it the same way, the wood and the weather and the color of the smoke, and when she loses a load, why? She has taught the method to 4 other small operators in 3 counties, people with their own woodlots and their own dead timber and their own reasons to want clean, honest heat, a young couple south of Bemidji, a retired millwright, a woman who runs a goat dairy and burns on the side. The brand has never gotten big, on purpose. It sells nationwide, and it is made by hand, by a handful of people, on a handful of acres, and that is not a limitation anyone is trying to fix. It is the whole point. Margaret Holt is old now, and she does not burn the mounds herself anymore. But she sits where she can see the smoke, and she still reads it, white to thin blue, and she still knows by the color when the char is nearly made. Soot is long gone, buried under the oak at the edge of the home place, and there is a younger dog by the kilns now, black again, lying close enough to the warmth and far enough from the heat, the way the good ones learn to. Let me tell you the thing this whole story is about, plainly, because I think it is worth saying out loud. There are two kinds of knowing in the world. There is the wide, shallow, confident kind, the kind that can price 1,000 woodlots in an afternoon, and is usually right, and is trained to measure what is easy to measure. And there is the narrow, deep, patient kind, the kind that knows one piece of ground or one craft or one fire so completely that it can see value where the wide knowing sees only ash. The county was full of the first kind in 1994, and it laughed at the second kind, and the second kind was right. What a system measures and what is actually valuable are two different things, and the gap between them is where people like Margaret Holt live and work, unseen, until a dry summer or a signed agreement makes the gap impossible to ignore. The confident path and the patient path ran side by side for 20 years across one section of Minnesota farmland, and for 19 of those years, the confident path looked like the winner. It took a drought to show which one had been built to last. Margaret never called herself wealthy, and she would not let you call her it either. The money was never the proof. The proof was the ring of two pieces of good charcoal knocked together, the same clean note her father heard, the note that means the wood gave up everything but its carbon and its fire. What is rigid breaks in the bad year? What is patient and attentive and rooted in one well-known piece of ground is what survives to ring.